Very quickly, think of the best trip you've ever taken. Now, think of the worst one. Different countries, probably, different years, different reasons. You never confuse the two. Now, here's something that may bother you. Your brain is using the same shortcut to store both of them in your memory. I'm Kiara, and this is Put the Guidebook Down. Here's the assumption that we're all walking around with. A good trip gets remembered well because it was mostly good, and a bad trip gets remembered badly because it was mostly bad, or there was a big moment that disrupted the itinerary or left you feeling a little shaken. Now, here's what we currently think and how we approach memory. We like to think of it as a running total. Add up the good days, subtract the bad ones. Whatever's left is how you'll feel about that moment later, or in this case, that vacation. So if you're able to recall more good from the trip than the bad, it must have been a good trip, right? Well, that's not exactly how this works. And it's not a small miss. It's basically backwards. Your memory of a trip isn't built from the whole vacation. It's built from almost none of it. Not the 8 forgettable dinners, not the 3 days you spent recovering from a time change, not the very fine, very average Tuesday you spent walking around doing not much of anything, and probably not the walking tour that felt really great in the moment because you're like, yay, I'm learning a lot about the place I'm in, but then you already forget about it 36 hours later. Your memory is quietly throwing almost all of that out and keeping maybe 2 moments from the entire vacation. And here's the part that should really make you think and actually maybe unsettle you. It's the same 2-moment rule, whether the trip was the best one of your life or the worst. I'm going to explain why. Because once you see the mechanism, you'll never plan the end of a trip or maybe your itinerary in the same way. Starting with discussing what actually gets kept, the peak end rule. In the early 1990s, psychologist Kahneman and his colleagues ran an experiment that sounds almost cruel, maybe a little disgusting when you hear it described. Patients undergoing colonoscopies, yes, we're talking about colonoscopies here, which at the time were far more uncomfortable, believe it or not, than they are now. Although some people may say that even with the current procedure, it's still very uncomfortable. We're split into 2 groups. One group had the standard procedure of the colonoscopy. The other group had the same procedure plus extra time at the end where the scope was left in place, still causing mild discomfort, just less intense than the main procedure. By any rational accounting, the second group experienced more total pain. But when researchers asked patients afterward to rate how painful the whole procedure was, the second group, the ones with the additional minutes with the scope left in place, and more total pain, rated the experience as less painful overall. They were also more likely to come back for a follow-up procedure. This may seem shocking, but that result only makes sense once you understand what your memory is actually doing. It's not averaging your experience across time. It's sampling 2 points, the most intense moment of the whole thing, or in this case, the procedure, what we call the peak. Let's be clear here. We're talking about the peak of the moment and however it happened at the end of that duration of time. Everything else gets discarded almost entirely. Researchers call this the peak end rule, and it's one of the most consistently replicated findings in the study of memory and experience. Translate that to travel, and the implication is uncomfortable. Your best trip isn't the sum of every great moment on it. It's one extraordinary moment plus how the trip was wrapped up at the end. Your worst trip isn't the sum of every miserable one either. Same rule. Same 2 data points, completely regardless of which direction the trip actually went, good or bad. So let's pivot to a shorter trip in one of my travels, since I feel like I like to reference my time living abroad a lot. So we're going to use my example of one of my first trips to Bulgaria for a conference. The easiest memory that I can immediately recall when I think of Bulgaria is the time I opted for a cheaper flight to return back to Moldova and had to walk around Sofia with my suitcase. And all of us budget travelers know this moment of where you didn't want to opt for the later checkout and you didn't want to take the earlier flight. So you want to save money, you just take the kind of embarrassing walk of shame with the suitcase. I like to say the budget traveler walk of shame. But regardless, we still get to see more and we save money so we can see more places. Anyways, back to the story. I decided to sit down while walking around in the park under a tree to check my departure time and make sure that I had my transportation locked down to get to the airport. And during this moment, I got crapped on by a bird. Yes, I had a bird crap on my hair. My mom and grandmother used to tell me that when a bird poops on you, it means good luck. But I don't know how that is lucky considering I was stuck with bird poop on me all the way through my 15 journey, returning back to Moldova with no way to really get it off of me despite all of the scrubbing of my hair in the airport bathroom in Sofia. So my memory of that trip to Bulgaria has been reduced to one of the high points of singing karaoke of Bad Romance by Lady Gaga at the conference with my colleagues, and then the ending of a bird pooping on my head. That's the peak end rule at work. My trip has been compacted and stored to karaoke and bird poop. But honestly, I'm not mad about this anymore. I mean, in the moment, it was not very great, but they both make for great stories now. Now, the peak end rule explains what memory keeps. There's a companion finding from the same research that explains what it drops, and it's arguably stranger of the two. Kahneman and psychologist Barbara Fredrickson found that the actual length of an experience barely affects how it gets remembered at all. Two experiences with the same peak and the same ending get rated almost identically, whether one lasted 3 minutes and the other one lasted 30. They called this the duration neglect. Kahneman later described this with a distinction that makes it click. Essentially, there are two selves, an experiencing self and a remembering self. The experiencing self is the one actually living through each moment of the trip, hour by hour, day by day, including all the remarkable moments and the unremarkable ones. The remembering self is the one you actually consult afterward, the one telling the story at dinner, the one deciding whether the trip was worth it in the end. And the remembering self is nearly blind to the duration that the experiencing self went through. To the remembering self, an 8-day trip and a 3-day trip with the same peak and the same ending are basically the same trip. Shocking, right? Which means all of those extra days, the ones where you were actually there, actually alive, walking around, eating something forgettable, waiting for a train, aren't gone because nothing happened. They're gone because the version of you that files the trip away for storage in your brain was never counting them to begin with. And I've talked about this in a previous episode in the show because it's something that I've worried about personally, in that I have had a bad memory or I'm forgetting some of the best moments of my life where I got to go and experience traveling to different countries and learning about different cultures. But this framework explains that it's just a normal act of the memory. That is just me being human. And it all goes back to the peaks. Now, shifting from one of the shorter travel memories of myself to one of the longer living abroad examples, because this is exactly the mechanism at work. For those moments where I lived abroad in Indonesia and Moldova, I remember the experiences as good overall. I remember the excitement of the departure, the stress of the arrival, and figuring everything out on the day-to-day. I remember some of the exciting side quests in between, with the happy memories of meeting new people, and then the extreme emotions at the end when saying goodbye to everyone and having to return back. Those moments living abroad were clearly through longer periods of time. So there were definitely several bad moments in between when problems arose or there were hurdles to overcome. And additionally, thousands of other memories in between all of these other high peaks, medium peaks, and smaller peaks. But it all got lost amongst all of the other positive memories and energy that I associate with the time period and condense only to a few peaks or high points within those time periods, like the arrival, the excitement of establishing a routine, or the high emotional period of saying goodbye. So while I know there are years of memory and content there, they just feel reduced to only a few core memories. And this does make me a little sad that I lost this content, which is why I travel journal and encourage all my friends to keep a travel journal, because you're able to then recall those memories in later readings. But again, we can't put this pressure on ourselves to have to remember everything because we're only human. Put those two mechanisms at work together, and here's what they explain. The best trip you've taken and the worst trip you've taken are being stored by the exact same process. Peak, then ends. Everything in between is rounding error, whether it was extraordinary or completely unremarkable. So if your memory of a trip really does come down to two moments, what does that say about the rest of it? The days you actually spent there? Were those 1 to 2 day extensions to save money actually worth it in the end? I don't think that this whole loss or trip definition to small amount of peaks means that those days altogether didn't matter. And you most likely don't need to label yourself as having a bad memory. Your experiencing self was there for all of them, and that self is real, even if nobody consults it later. Because remember, in one of the previous episodes we talked about it, is that you are building yourself abroad and giving space for those other layers within you to rise to the surface. But it does mean the story you'll eventually tell about the trip that you may call the best one of your life was decided by a lot less of the actual trip than you'd assume. Most of it never even made it into the evidence of your memory. And this cuts both ways, which is the part that actually matters if you're the one planning the trip. A rough trip that happens to end well can be remembered fondly, almost regardless of how rough the middle actually was. A wonderful trip that ends badly, such as a missed flight, cancellation, getting sick on the last day, can get remembered as a disappointment, even if 9 out of 10 days were great. The end isn't just one data point amongst many. It's doing the majority amount of the work when it comes to memory. So this is where, as I've said in my previous episodes, you need to make room in the itinerary for spontaneity and to be flexible and adaptable to what comes, because it can make or break your trip overall. So here's what I'd ask you to sit with. Go back to the best trip and that worst trip that I asked you to reflect about at the beginning of the episode. Try to name what the actual peak and the actual ending of each one was. Then notice how much of the rest of the trips that you genuinely can recall or can't recall in detail, good and bad. That's not a flaw in your memory. That's just what it was built to do. But it also means the next time you're closing out a hard travel day or ending a difficult trip, the ending still counts for far more than you think it should. Maybe that's worth planning around. Maybe it's worth taking that last side quest to really close out the end of the trip. I would also like to encourage positive reframing, regardless of a moment, because trying to find something happy, even within an instance which is out of your control, it does go a long way. As my colleagues remember me and my motto through all of my moments in Indonesia, which is why I associate my time over there, regardless of highs and lows, it's just positive overall, is because I brought my motto with me everywhere I went with my mindset. Selalu energi positif, which literally means always positive energy. I'm Kiara. This is Put the Guidebook Down. Guidebooks tell you where to go. We're here for why you went. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.